This car was designed to race at the Indy 500, but it ended up making its debut at the 2012 Le Mans 24 Hours. It was built out of a failed Aston Martin, and its racing career ended mired in legal controversy. This is the very strange story of one of the most interesting racing cars of a generation. This is the story of the Deltawing. Ben Bowlby is a genius, and he's got an unconventional way of thinking and an unconventional way of working as well. He worked for years heading up the engineering team at Lola, working on many of its customer racing projects from Champ Car to Le Mans and even touring cars. He later went to America to work for Chip Ganassi's NASCAR and Indycar projects, including the wild project of converting a railway tunnel into a highly advanced aerodynamic facility. We'll have to come back to that one. When Indycar announced that it was looking for a new car for the 2011 or 2012 season, yeah, that's not an error, Bowlby wanted to submit something that was utterly revolutionary, and with Chip Ganassi's blessing, he came up with the Deltawing. He didn't want it to be a one-make chassis design, instead he wanted to drastically change the sport. He came up with a car which was half the weight and had half the power, but could theoretically still lap Indianapolis at 235 miles an hour. One way it could achieve this was by having a massive reduction in aerodynamic drag. Bowlby estimated that 54% of a Dallara IR-05's drag came from its exposed wheels, so the Deltawing simply shrouded them. However, the real breakthrough was the narrow front track. By reducing the width between the front wheels, and in turn the bodywork around them, he suddenly found that there was loads of clean airflow to the underside of the car either side of the monocoque. Originally, Bowlby wanted to have fully enclosed front wheels, but there was concern about the brakes and the tyres in particular overheating. A free-wheeled layout was also considered, but the FIA definition of a car states that it must have at least 4 wheels, 2 of which must be used for steering. The Indy 500, though, is a car race, so to compete, it must have 4 wheels. Imagine it, though, a 235-mile-an-hour tricycle lapping Indianapolis Motor Speedway. That would have been a sight to behold. In the original concept of the car, some of the steering effort could have come from torque vectoring at the rear wheels, though ultimately that technique was seemingly never used on any of the running Deltawings. To prove the concept to Chip Ganassi, and indeed anybody else who cared to listen, Bowlby made 2 1/8 scale model radio-controlled cars to show that it could indeed turn. The Firestone Tyre Company management saw these model tests and apparently as a result started development work on rubber to fit to the full-scale car. These were not the only models used in the car development either. When Bowlby was first dreaming up the Indycar version, or perhaps the later sports car version, he used 1/18 scale models of the concept, which he dropped into his swimming pool at varying angles to see what happened. A few shades of Barnes Wallis and the bouncing bomb, but it was a valid, if unconventional, aerodynamic development technique. Wind tunnel tests and CFD data suggested that the coefficient of drag for the Deltawing Indycar would be about 0.24. When the first concept car was revealed at the Chicago Auto Show in early 2010, many suggested that it looked a lot like Craig Breedlove's Spirit of America land speed record car, and you can see why. But they were really overlooking the rear, and it's at the rear where all of the action is on this car. Unusually, under the bodywork of the car, the engine and transmission were not to be fully stressed parts, and they would instead sit in a sort of cradle at the rear, meaning that a wide range of different power unit options could be accommodated. Don't forget, at this point, the engine rules for the 2012 IndyCar season were not defined. However, for an engine to truly work in the Deltawing and for the concept to achieve its design objectives, the engine would have to be really, really light, around 75 kilograms, and any more and the concept would kind of start to drift away. The Toyota and Honda V8s of the time weighed 127 kilograms. To balance performance of engines used in the car, I do truly dislike balance of performance, by the way, a fuel flow limit would be used, and this was long before Formula One had introduced one, but it's long after Colin Chapman had first proposed it. The chassis of the car had a slightly more upright seating position compared to the Dallara IR-05. Bizarrely, Bowlby and the newly founded Deltawing Racing Cars LLC had no interest in actually building any cars themselves. Instead, they planned to make the whole design open source. They would make their money by licensing the manufacturing rights to approved suppliers. Those suppliers could actually vary the design as well, making this far from a one-make formula. It was actually a total rethink of the whole race car construction business model. However, this was one model which would ultimately not be tested. The Deltawing wasn't selected for the 2012 IndyCar project, and instead Dallara won the contract with what went on to become the IR-12 and later the DW-12. Bowlby, though, was not finished. He truly believed in his concept, and he enlisted some more help, Don Panos and Dan Gurney. He had to convince them that Deltawing would work even if IndyCar didn't actually want it. The first hints of a Le Mans specification Deltawing appeared in early 2011 when Bowlby shared a CAD sketch of his Deltawing concept, but this sketch was very different. It looked a bit bigger and it had headlights in the wider rear bodywork. Most notably though, it had a roof. It was clear Bowlby wanted to take the Deltawing to Le Mans. There was just one small issue for Bowlby. The Deltawing car, it didn't meet the technical regulations for Le Mans. In fact, it didn't meet any technical regulations for anything. Bowlby had just kind of made it up. However, Bowlby was in luck. The ACO had created a new category for the 2012 Le Mans 24 Hours for a single car only. And this came after it had linked a small remote section of 5 garages at one end of the main pit building to the main structure itself, increasing the number of pit garages to 56. That number's since increased. Rather than just widen out the general entry to just an extra normal Le Mans car, the 56 pit was decided to be reserved for cars showing innovative technologies. This reserved entry is still called Garage 56 to this day. I do wonder if, knowing a little bit about French motor racing politics, if this Garage 56 concept was actually created for Yves Courage, who had an all-electric Le Mans car, something we will come back to, but I think that Garage 56 concept was specifically created for him, but I don't think he had the funding in place to be able to compete. And on top of that, the Green GT from Welter Racing, the other car that applied for that Garage 56 slot in 2012, well, that car wasn't ready to run, so that just left the Deltawing. And it was ultimately Deltawing that got the Garage 56 entry. While the Deltawing Le Mans car was originally conceived as a closed-top car, the very short lead time of the project since the ACO gave the entry to Deltawing at the 2011 Le Mans 24 Hours, there wasn't very much time to get a running car built. So a pragmatic approach needed to be taken by Bowlby. That actually resulted in it being an open car. Bowlby knew that he needed a chassis to base the car on, and there just wasn't time to design one from scratch and go through all the crash testing and homologation procedure. However, George Howard Chappell of Aston Martin Racing heard on the grapevine that Bowlby needed a chassis, and he had just the thing, the Aston Martin AMR-ONE. Yes, that Aston Martin. While the Aston Martin was a complete disaster in 2011 and the project had ultimately been cancelled, a number of chassis had been completed. There were the 2 cars which had raced at Le Mans in 2012 and at least one spare tub. Now, one of those chassis was already being used by Pescarolo Sport on its new LMP1 car, but at least one other chassis was available for Bowlby to use. Having an open car was beneficial in some ways. It was lighter than a closed car, and on paper at least it would generate less lift in a spin, and at the time there was a real concern about Le Mans prototypes taking off and flying after a number of scary crashes. Interestingly, prior to Le Mans in 2012, Deltawing claimed to have 2 AMR-ONE chassis, as did Pescarolo, which would mean that 4 chassis had to have been built, but I can only be certain that 3 chassis were built. One remains in the Panos Museum in Brazelton, Georgia, and the other 2 remain built up as complete AMR-ONEs in private collections. If there is a 4th chassis, I don't know where it is, so has anyone got any ideas? Let me know in the comments if you do know where there is a 4th Aston Martin. The Aston Martin AMR-ONE was, for its curious appearance and flawed execution, a conventional Le Mans prototype, but the Deltawing was anything but. If Bowlby were to make the Aston Martin chassis work, then he simply couldn't use the existing suspension mounting points at the front of the tub. Don't forget, the Deltawing was a narrow track car, but any modifications made to the tub itself would result in a new crash test being needed, and there simply wasn't the time for that, and if he did need to do a new crash test, there wouldn't have been any point in buying a pre-existing chassis that wasn't purpose-built for his needs. So to get around this problem, a new front chassis was constructed which would carry the front suspension, steering and braking systems. This forward section of the chassis was created by All American Racers, Dan Gurney's famous company responsible for the gorgeous Eagle F1 cars amongst many other things. It would mount to the Aston Martin tub using the same same mounting points as the normal nose and front impact structure would have done. This would mean that a new nose had to be designed and crash tested, but that's a much quicker job than redoing an entire chassis. AAR got involved in the project after Chip Ganassi decided that his company didn't have the capacity to take on the Deltawing Le Mans car. Indeed, from that point on, AAR played a key role in building the Deltawing. Ultimately, the Deltawing team did plan to modify the AMR-ONE chassis in terms of the rear bulkhead at least, in order to get the 28% front weight distribution that Bowlby demanded from the car. And to do that, the engine had to be positioned as far forward into the tub as possible. And this used up all of the recess at the rear of the tub, which was there for the oil tank of the Aston Martin Straight 6. That recess would also have to be widened a bit as well. Now, I'm not sure if this work was ever actually done, but it was planned. But had it been done, the car would again have needed a new crash test. Another major change with the Le Mans Deltawing compared with the original Indycar concept, and indeed the show cars that Bowlby produced to show off the Le Mans concept, is that it was much shorter than originally envisaged. The nose section just didn't extend as long. This is because the ACO requested that the maximum length of the car was no more than 4.65 metres, because that was the largest size of car that the pit boxes at Le Mans would accept. The Deltawing, though, needed power, and this is where Nissan entered the chat. Nissan's global motorsport programs were then headed by Darren Cox, a motor industry executive with a rather unconventional approach and a beard, and he appreciated the innovative approach of Bowlby. Nissan commissioned, or at least funded, Ray Mallock Limited, RML, to design, develop and build a bespoke lightweight engine for the Deltawing to use at Le Mans. When the first track tests were done, the car was fitted with an interim engine. Nobody ever really spoke in great detail about that, and I never got too much information about it at the time, but looking at it, I do think it was based on the same 1.6 litre 4-cylinder engine used in the Chevy Cruze and Chevy Lucetti World Touring cars, which had been built by RML. The proper Deltawing engine was a 1.6 litre turbocharged inline 4-cylinder engine producing about 300 horsepower. There were some vague claims that it was based on a Nissan Duke production car engine, but I think this was really just a bunch of marketing. There was also some suggestion that the throttle body did come from the Duke road car, and I think that's possibly true, but it's likely that the engine overall had a bit more in common with the RML Chevy World Touring car engine. But it wasn't the same though. The engine internals at the very least were developed to be as light as possible and were quite different to anything that would have been allowed in the World Touring Car Championship. 300 horsepower was nothing in comparison with the latest Le Mans cars. Even the GT cars had quite a lot more than that. The Mazda branded AER 2-litre engine used by some LMP2 cars that year produced 500 brake horsepower, and at 74 kilograms it would also have fitted the Deltawing. The Nissan RML engine weighed about 70 kilos. Driving the rear wheels was not a simple task, and US company EMCO developed a bespoke transmission that weighed 33 kilograms. If you're interested in gearbox design, this is definitely one to read up on, but this video is already super long without getting to all of the detail talking about cogs. Aerodynamic development on the car was extensive, with the Indycar work still available. More development was done on the Le Mans specification of the Deltawing, initially in CFD, then at 40% scale in the wind tunnel, and then finally at full scale using the wind shear wind tunnel in North Carolina. A lot of this work was done to recover some of the losses from using the Aston Martin chassis. A dedicated Deltawing chassis would have allowed for larger tunnels in the floor, but the AMR-ONE was instead designed for a through-car tunnel approach, which would have had zero relevance on a car with no bodywork beyond the side of the chassis. Interestingly, some elements of the 1981 Eagle Pepsi Challenger car carried over to the Deltawing. Note the design of the side entry tunnel, part of the boundary layer adhesion technology concept, or BLAT. I think I probably have to leave that car for a video all of its own because it is quite fascinating. After some development, the Deltawing ended up with a 25% front aerodynamic balance, and it had a drag coefficient of 0.313. This compared to the 0.24 of the Indycar variant. Bowlby was militant about drag and didn't even want to use rear view mirrors and wanted to use a rear view camera system instead. Corvette Racing had done that for some time at Le Mans, but the ACO insisted that the mirrors were to be fitted to the car. Like the Corvette, it had to be fitted. They were in the regulations. Note this version with a single rear view mirror. But Bowlby found that the mirrors actually contributed 8% drag to the car overall. The design of the mirrors was pretty much the same as they were on the AMR-ONE, but they were relocated tighter to the monocoque because there was no more bodywork to mount them on beyond the front of that. Notably, the tail fin of the car, which in the concept sketches and in the IndyCar version canted rearward like a fighter jet fin, was sanitised somewhat, and it terminated in line with the rest of the rear bodywork, but it did also start a bit further forward than originally planned. This was due to the ACO demanding that the car had no bodywork overhanging at the rear. Some unconventional solutions were trialled in the development of the car, including putting the engine air filter in the rear bodywork, as you can see in this picture, but this design didn't make it onto the final car. There was also a fair bit of work on the spoiler at the rear of the car, with a few different variants tested. A lot of composites work had to be done on the bodywork, which in its original wind shear test specification and even its shakedown specification was found to be 9 kilograms overweight, and it had to be lightened prior to Le Mans. The target weight for the vehicle overall was 575 kilograms. This compared to the minimum weight of a then current LMP2 car of 900 kilograms. If the Deltawing could run at LMP2 pace on half the power and in theory using half the fuel, then the project would clearly have been validated. The front suspension of the car was very conventional in terms of its concept, but it looked just wildly out of scale with its extremely short wishbones, barely leaving space for the spring and damper units and even the brake ducting. I mean, just look at it. I'll leave some others to explain the steering system, other than to say that on this part of the car, even Bowlby had to call in some help. The rear suspension, on the other hand, was quite a sight to behold, and I'm not really sure how to describe it. It obviously had a double wishbone layout, and that's the easy bit, but the spring and damper units were actuated by push rods linked to pull rods, and then there were some rockers and some cranks. Here's a picture, you work it out, and yes, this video is already getting very long, but this car is incredibly interesting, isn't it? The front tyres were a major challenge for Deltawing. It didn't conform to any common racing tyre size. They were just over 10 centimetre wide, and that was not the only issue. The tyres would need to sit on bespoke 15-inch rims from BBS. Those rims only had 3 wheel nuts on each of them, and I think that was partly for weight saving, but partly because that just seemed the right approach. I did hear at the time that a Citroën 2CV used the same tyre size and stud pattern. I'm not sure if that was true, but I want to think it is, and also it allows me to refer to 2CV Cross, which is a level of madness of motorsport that I absolutely love. At the rear, more conventional racing wheels and tyres were used with central nuts. At Le Mans, the car was a complete sensation. It got huge media coverage before and after the event. Everybody loved the Deltawing, even with its strange looks. The car got far more media coverage than any other car in the race, including the car of the race winner. Even though the race itself wasn't a great success, the car's marketing campaign was one that needs studying in future. In terms of its on-track performance, the ACO had given Bowlby and Deltawing a target lap time of 3 minutes 45, and they expected the car to have a top speed of 300 kph. It exceeded both of these targets in qualifying with a best lap of 3 minute 42.6 and a top speed of 309 kph. That was good enough for 29th overall, and it was ahead of 4 of the LMP2 cars, but that fastest lap could have been even faster. Some estimate that the pace of the car could have been up to the front runners in the LMP2 category, but on that fastest lap the car's fire extinguisher came loose and that cost it a little bit of time, so it's a little bit of a what might have been story there. The race itself started very well for the Deltawing, but after 75 laps, disaster struck. A misjudgment from Kazuki Nakajima's Toyota, battling with an Audi, saw the Japanese car hit the Deltawing in the Porsche curves, firing the Nissan branded machine into the unguarded concrete wall at speed and causing a huge amount of damage. A valiant effort saw driver Satoshi Motoyama spend 90 minutes trying to get the car back onto track and back to the pits for repair, but the damage was just too much, and eventually the car was very emotionally retired from the race. The full clip is still available on, I think, Nissan's channel, and it's worth watching. I'll put a link down in the description. That was not the end of the story for the Deltawing. Le Mans felt like unfinished business to both Nissan and Deltawing, so Nissan did the logical thing and entered it into Petit Le Mans at Road Atlanta in the USA. The build-up to that race was full of unwanted drama though. A GT Porsche in practice forced the car off and into a huge crash where it flipped over. This accident and the one at Le Mans amplified some doubts about the visibility of the car for other drivers with its long, low and narrow front end. And this is part of the reason that at Road Atlanta, the rollover structures were brightly painted. After some major efforts in the pit garage, or pit tent as it really is in American Le Mans Series terms, by Highcroft Racing, Nissan and Deltawing, the Deltawing was rebuilt and ready to race. It was a good race for the car, and the car crossed the line in 6th position, and it was later promoted to 5th after one of the cars in front was disqualified. This was also the last race where the Deltawing wore Nissan branding and used the RML Nissan power unit. The Deltawing was only ever intended to be a prototype vehicle, essentially a one-off. However, Don Panos had planned to build more using a bespoke brand new chassis, not based on the Aston Martin. And eventually he did do that, but by then the whole project was surrounded in controversy and mess, and that's a whole other story. We are going to come back to that. That controversy also saw the Nissan branding removed from the Deltawing, as I mentioned, and ahead of the 2013 American Le Mans Series, a new chrome livery was applied to the car. The Nissan branded RML engine was gone too, and it was replaced by a new 1.9 litre turbocharged 4-cylinder Mazda-based engine from Panos Elan. The car raced 5 times that year with a best result of 5th position, coming its last ever race held in August 2013. And here the original Deltawing story comes to an end, but this story is far, far from over, so stay tuned. There's a lot more I'm going to be talking about here. If you've enjoyed watching this narrow track tale of different thinking and not a little bit of controversy, don't worry, there is a huge amount more to come. But for now, thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe. See you soon somewhere on Pit Road.